I'm going to introduce the very first speaker for this session, which is Stephan Heunis. He's a PhD candidate in the Electrical Engineering Department of Eindhoven University of Technology. His main research focus is to develop new signal processing methods, software tools, and processes to improve the quality of real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging for clinical use. He recently co-chaired the Open Science Room at HBM 2020, and he will be talking about brain research data and personal data privacy, practical tips to share and protect. Stephan, the floor is yours. Thanks.
So yes, thank you, Vittorio, for the introduction. I would like to just say, to apologize for the sound of my voice. I'm still recovering from a cold. But you should be able to understand what I say. So I'm going to talk about brain research data and personal data privacy, and specifically looking at practical ways in which we can both share our data, but also protect the privacy of individuals. You are welcome to note my details at the bottom of the slide, and you can contact me on Twitter or on email if you have any questions or you want to chat about this topic. So some notes and disclaimers. First thing is that I'm not a legal expert, and I'm going to be talking about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But all the words I use are not specifically chosen to be as legally compliant as possible, so please take note of that. My history is I'm an engineer and a researcher, and I've just been working on a bunch of projects where we try to make the GDPR compliance of brain research data sharing more understandable and more usable practically. And a lot of the work that I'll present here is not just by myself, it's mostly done by a whole big group of people. So you can ask questions, that I think is fine. There's a short link where you can access the slides if you want. Before, after, or during. You can also just email me and ask for this link afterwards. And I'm going to be using a lot of memes, and I hope you like them. So first I want to thank all the people. There's a lot of names, and there's also some links to projects that we've been working on where a lot of this work came from. So thank you for everyone listed here, and also for the people that I forgot to list. It's been quite a wild ride, but really interesting and I think very fruitful. So, a PhD student walks into a virtual open science workshop and learns about transparency. So, I really like this quote where it says an article about computational science in a publication is not the scholarship itself. It's when you look at things like the data, the complete set of instructions, the complete computational environment, all the things you do to be able to report the results is the actual scholarship. And when we take that message, we also can learn about computational reproducibility. And I think that shifts the focus from where we just look at the results in an article and say, trust me, I'm a scientist, you should believe what we say in this article. And it shifts that focus to something that's more like, show me. I want to understand, I want to query your results, I want to verify them, and I also want to build upon them. So it shouldn't be this thing where like, here is something we started with, and then a miracle occurs, and then we have results. We should be able to query all the steps in between. And I think that leads to this understanding of computational reproducibility, where we want to use data and the same code and the same computational environment, and then try to get the same results. And if they're different, start querying that and try to understand why, and if it's better, if you can improve upon that. Sorry about that. So a PhD student learns about this process and thinks, okay, this is great. From now on, we're gonna do all of the open science. And the first point where the PhD student starts is looking at sharing data. And this PhD student is in the field of MRI, MRI research, so sharing MRI data. And as we all do, at the start of anything big, we make a list. So we make a list of valid reasons for sharing data. There are a bunch, and I think it's centers a lot around of the concept of transparency in science. So if we can get access to the same data, we can start querying and verifying the results that go along with that. We can reuse that for other purposes. So we can prevent research waste, for example. It also adds to the scientific body of evidence. So we can use that data and do meta-analyses, etc. I think generally it improves, like on a high level, it improves the trust in what we're trying to do as scientists, because it's, again, this not trust me, it's the show me approach. And yeah, I list a bunch of other valid reasons for sharing data, which I think some of you might be able to connect with. But of course, there are also valid concerns when you share data. So, and topmost of that is number one, personal data privacy and the security of your participants, which everyone should definitely take into account. There are other concerns that I'm not going to go through, but they're listed, and you can also add to that. So the PhD student makes the list and figures out, okay, data privacy is really important, and then we're working in the EU, so let's read up on the European Data Protection Regulation. And there's a link to all the recitals that you can read if you have a bunch of time and if you like to read boring stuff. So to protect the privacy of individuals and their data, this regulation exists. It does not apply to anonymous data, and we'll get into what that means. And you need a legal basis for collecting, processing, and sharing personal data of research participants or of any person. Another important point of the GDPR is that data subjects have to be sufficiently informed as to the purpose of their data processing. Why is it being collected? Why is it being processed? And they also have to know about their rights, the rights that they can exercise with regards to their data. For example, if they have the right to ask for the data to be deleted, they need to know about that. They need to know how that is possible to do. And I think something else that's really important about the GDPR is that it necessitates the data controller, the person who's in charge of managing this data set, to understand what the risks are to the individual's data privacy. And we need to understand that and to kind of codify that and to communicate it well with participants. Okay, so now the GDPR, the PhD student knows about the GDPR like on a high level. But they also realize that the GDPR is really complicated for research data. So like, what does anonymous mean? Which steps should I take to de-identify a data set or a subject's data set such that we can say, okay, now it's anonymous and everything before that is not anonymous. And also if you do it in the wrong way, should we bear the risk as individual researchers, or is the research institution? Like, where does that risk responsibility lie? Also questions like, what type of legal basis should I choose? And can I put my data on, for example, a repository like OpenNeuro, which is outside of the EU? Does it have to be in my country? Does it have to be in the EU? Like, what is necessary before I can just share it? So they go to their data protection office and they speak to a GDPR lawyer or the data steward or whatever level of person is available there. And they realize also that there are different views on data sharing. So for example, you might come across a data protection officer from a legal background that says the risk is too high, which is understandable, so we're not going to share. You might also come across a data protection officer with a different background, with different viewpoint that says, well, we can share, but this and this and this and this and this. So still, it's complicated. So to get even more information about this, the PhD student goes to colleagues at different universities, different countries. And they soon realize that there are so many interpretations of the GDPR and how that practically applies to their own circumstance that it's really difficult to figure out, like, what practically do you have to do, do you have to put in place to be able to share your participants' data. And meanwhile, while the PhD student's busy with all of this, like, the standard pressures of your everyday job is there. So you need to write papers. So the point being here that it's not the focus of an individual researcher necessarily to figure out, like, how to share data responsibly. And you're not allocated the time and resources for that. And sometimes when you might ask your supervisor, who might not have been brought up in a scientific environment where you share data as a standard, they just say, okay, just add the clause data available on request. And I think a lot of us know what that typically means. Like, data is probably not available because, like, emails is not answered or whatever the reason. So in the end, you're as a PhD student really frustrated, like, should I share or should I not share? That is the question. So in an effort to alleviate the stress involved in that decision, you just make another list. So like, distilling more on a deeper practical level, what do we have to put in place to be able to share our research data? So firstly, how do I choose a legal basis for processing personal data? How do I define if data is anonymous or not? Which steps do I take to mitigate the risk of personal data privacy? And that includes things like the identification of your data, but also putting another different type of mitigator in place, such as the data use agreement. And then how should I communicate all of this to my participants? What about primary and secondary processing of personal data? And also, what about data management plans and privacy impact assessments? So let's look a bit at these things. Legal basis for processing data. So according to GDPR, you can select one of 6 legal bases for processing personal data. One is consent, performance of a contract, compliance of a legal obligation, to protect the vital interests of the data subject. And then 5 and 6, tasks carried out in the public interest or in the legitimate interest of the controller. And I've highlighted consent number 1, number 5, and 6, because those are the ones most likely to be chosen as legal basis for research data, specifically MRI data. And I think consent is probably the most likely. So you ask already for consent for your research participants to participate in the actual study. So that comes from good clinical practice and ethical approval that you need in order to conduct the study, stemming from things like the Declaration of Helsinki. So in that process, you could also incorporate now all the new GDPR compliance aspects that's required, and then also ask for consent to process, to collect, process, and share their data. And that's the one that I will be focusing on a bit. Although it could also be argued that what we do as researchers is in the public interest, and we're doing work that helps us understand the brain more or helps us diagnose specific diseases or disorders related to our brains. So we could say, sure, maybe that is the best case. And then different pros and cons go along with these different bases. Then we come to personal pseudonymous or pseudo-anonymous. I don't know which one is the best, but I'll just say pseudonymous. And then also anonymous data. So on a really high level, anonymous data is data that's not traceable to individuals. So I can have an anonymous MRI data set in theory, and if I cannot link that to a specific person, that is anonymous. So there's by no reasonable means can I re-identify using algorithms, using external databases, using whatever, to get to that person again. And according to the GDPR, that is not applicable to, does not have to be compliant to the GDPR. So if you define that the data set is fully anonymous, you can process it without getting consent, without needing a legal basis. You can just go crazy with the data set. But then personal data is data which is traceable, re-identifiable, indirectly or directly. So if it's directly, it should be fine because, not fine, it should be a standard thing that you use to identify a person, like a picture of that person's face or their name or their address or whatever. Typically, we will not put that type of data online in any case. Like you should definitely not. Yeah, we won't take our data and just like in the file name, write the participant's name and then upload it to whatever thing. Indirectly traceable is more, we use other data to help identify a person. So if you, for example, have a cohort of people, you're looking at people over the age of 100, and you say that they live in a specific suburb of a specific place, then you give external data that makes it easier to identify that person, because you can go look at databases of people that are over 100 in a certain area. You might say there are only like 3 or something, and then makes it, increases the risk for that participant to be identified. So that would be indirect, and that's still personal data. So that could be pseudonymous data. So you could have removed the names, you could have removed their ages, you could have removed their pictures or genders or whatever from the data set, but then you still upload the information about living near London or being 105 years old or over a century. And that is pseudonymous because it's not directly traceable, but still indirectly. So when it comes to making data anonymous, specifically MRI data, it is quite complicated, and the aspects that I mentioned about there being a lot of interpretations is important. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do that's advised for MRI data. For example, you remove any identifying features like names and timestamps from the file names and from their metadata. Convert your data to the bits format. And that is already possible for fMRI data, for EEG, MEG, and T1 weighted and a few other types of MRI data. So you put it into a format where there's a standard structure. It's subject 1, subject 2, subject 3. You also deface, you also remove the face of the T1 weighted anatomical image. You can use different types of algorithms. You can deface it, you can blur it. Deface is where you just cut off a piece of that image. Reface is what they actually do also in AFNI, where you deface and you add like a standardized face. You can also do other measures like don't report the dates of birth, but rather report age when they're scanned. And also, even to mitigate the risk more, you can choose to not share like individual level data, but rather summary measures, like a statistical map in a standard space for a subject, or group maps or whatever. Another thing you can do is to delete the key that you have that links, like typically you would have like an Excel file or something that, or somewhere on database, the personal information is there, and that links it to the BIDS structure, subject, number, or something. And strict interpretation, sorry, that's BIDS, and that's a nice meme from Remy. So BIDS is just great, even if you want to use it for yourself and you don't want to share data, it's already just really useful. So the thing about the key is it depends on people's interpretation of GDPR. And a strict interpretation of GDPR says if the key exists, doesn't matter if it's securely kept behind whatever type of security measures, the data that exists, that's pseudonymized and that's shared, is still personal data. And that's why I add that your mileage may vary, because it is different for different institutions and depends on the history and knowledge of the and approach of the data protection officers and legal experts and researchers at those institutions. But so our approach is basically, it's still it's pseudonymous and it's still personal data if the key exists, and then you treat it as such. There's also the thing of the concept that's a really let's say contentious or pervasive in this type of discussions, where you need to be able to say with reasonable effort that one cannot in future, using state-of-the-art technology, re-identify a person. So if we say currently we cannot re-identify using whatever machine learning or AI methods we have available, is that still true for like 10 years from now? And is it still safe to share the data now if we think it might be possible to re-identify in future? And here I only post questions because I'm not sure I don't think we can give a clear answer except for then going towards the more strict interpretation of GDPR and just making it making it personal data, like stating that it is still personal data. So that's something to keep into account. Okay, so the PhD student has done all of this research and asked all of the questions and researched it a lot, and they've like not wasted but spent like a year of their time on figuring this stuff out. And then they say, okay, what's next? And it still kind of depends. So something that is then useful that the PhD student finds is open brain consent. And I think the sentence quote from their site nicely explains why it is useful, because there's no like accepted version of a consent form which would allow for the collected images to be shared as openly as possible with adequate guarantees for subjects' privacy. And I recently had a discussion also with a few colleagues where someone mentioned that we're talking about open data and open code, but let's also talk about open procedures. Like, can we share the information that we gather and improve upon them together as a community with regards to the processes that we follow before and after data collection and before and after publishing or sharing your code, etc. And I think this is a good example of one of those processes, the process of gathering consent for participating in a study, but also for sharing the data that you collect for that study. That is something that we can improve together as a community. And I think that is what open brain consent tries to do. So we're looking at templates, informed consent templates, and also translating these into multiple languages that people can use and then improve upon. And then also providing resources to be able to de-identify your data, such as anonymization tools. There's a nice link to the site. And then last year I was involved in the start of a project at the OHPM hackathon where we said, okay, open brain consent is great, but it does not yet take into account GDPR compliance. So we started trying to improve or build upon open brain consent to include GDPR aspects. And initially it was, and still it's a lot of conversations because there are so many interpretations, and it takes a really long time to find consensus that you can develop into practical suggestions for people to include in their documentation. So we're working on this, the still GDPR concepts M1, which is just to get some consensus amongst ourselves, like, what does GDPR mean in terms of data sharing for MRI studies? And then we want to take those learnings and put it into templates. And so we've worked on that at a few workshops and also asynchronously in between. And eventually we also want to get to a point where we can develop more educational content around all of this. So if anyone wants to join in on that front, you're very welcome. So we started also, I forgot to mention here at the top, there's documentation, and in brackets Q4 or 5. This refers back to the, let's see, these questions. I mentioned them, Q1, Q2, etc. So wherever I say Q4, Q5, I try to answer those questions. So this is how, at least I and some other people see how all of these things fit together to get to a point where we can practically implement them. So when you do a study, you have to, where's my pointer? There's my pointer, yeah. You have to do an ethics application. And in that, you have to include a bunch of stuff. You have to show the privacy information, participant information letter, which is important, and the consent form. And then I think we should also include the GDPR related stuff. So that includes data privacy impact assessment and the privacy notice and a data use agreement. And when we drill down into these things, the participant information letter is what the participant sees. And in that, we need to inform them fully and clearly what happens to their data. And so firstly, what will the study involve and why we need them as participants, but also what happens to their data and what our intention is with that. So in that sense, we will refer to data privacy impact assessment to the privacy notice. And I say /OBC, which is open bank consent, because the open bank consent GDPR version is essentially a privacy notice, which is the terminology that's used in GDPR terms. And then also this should include information that the GDPR expects, like you have to say which is like who is the controller, who should you be able to contact if you have a privacy concern. Of those contact details, everything should be included. And then also obviously the consent form, which asked for them to participate in the study, but also adds information and questions related to consent specifically for data sharing purposes. And then we, with the open bank consent, our intention is to provide templates and improve upon the templates for these things, like data privacy impact assessment, privacy notice, which I view essentially as the open bank consent GDPR edition, which there is a link to, I think, in one of the following slides. And then also a data use agreement. And I think one of the main reasons for including a data use agreement is to also add another risk mitigation step to the process, because we also see the pseudonymous data as still being personal data. You need to do whatever you can to take care of that. Here's just a screenshot from open bank consent, and you can see the GDPR edition is highlighted, and there's some documents. And it shows the sections that typically would form part of this. So usage and storage of your data, and your meaning the participant who reads this. What can we say about the confidentiality? Who has access to their data? How long will the data be kept? What do they want to do if they want to withdraw consent? What do they have to know if the data is shared with countries outside of the European Union? And then more information. And you can also see there's already a lot of translations there. Data use agreement, and here I post an example from the Donders repository from the Donders Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And the GDPR one for open bank consent was basically based on this one. So in this data use agreement, which anyone who wants to access the data needs to sign, like digitally with a check or something. They say they want access to the data for research, and in this case, we also have to include in our participant information letter, when we ask for their consent to share the data, we tell them we want to use it for the specific purpose of this study, but also for a secondary purpose of a research in a particular field. And again, that is up for interpretation. To what level of detail that particular field needs to be specified, and that differs also between different institutions. And then there's a bunch, I couldn't screenshot the whole screen, but there's a few other points here as well. But the main point there is that the person who now has access to the data can like takes on the responsibilities of a data controller in GDPR terms, and they have to also ensure the privacy of the participants in that sense, and they will not, they say they will not redistribute or try to identify the people by any means, and a few other steps. So I've also mentioned data management plan and data privacy impact assessments, and these are things that typically are not, when you read about the GDPR, they're not specified up front, but it's useful to have these things in any case, and in some cases the GDPR expects them. And this is, for example, just a very simple version that I drew up, like going through the steps of where data are acquired and then processed, and what do you do with that at each step. So you've got personal data, you then do the de-identification procedure, you do defacing, you remove headers, etc., like we mentioned, and you have to specify like the locations of these places. Where are they stored? Where are the data processed? Then decide whether you keep the key or not, and then also decide at the anonymous or pseudonymous step, where do you share it with or without a data use agreement. Also a very simple data privacy impact assessment, which again, we have to do upfront. And this is just few simple bullet points that give an indication, but this might differ per institution, like how they actually implement it. So the point is to specify like, what is the goal of the data processing, which parties are involved, so what are the data processors and the data controllers, which data types are the sensitive aspects, the things that really can infringe if people use that for whatever reason to infringe upon the privacy of individuals. And then talk about like what security measures are taken to mitigate risks to these personal data privacy. So privacy, they talk a lot about privacy by design, privacy by default, or privacy enhancing technologies that I'll not speak a lot more about. And then what is the selected lawful basis for processing the data? So these things actually, it's important to see that these have to be defined up front before you actually do the study. Okay, so we've not tried to share all our data. We've learned a lot. And in the end, you're like just completely tired of trying to share your data. And I would like, with our process of working with the open brand consent and not even under that name necessarily, but just working together as a community, trying to improve these practices and share them and get more consensus, I would like to get to this point where we say data sharing, yes, GDPR, yes, or data privacy, yes. That's actually what I should have said on the right-hand side. So we want to get to a point where we have both, and we can be sure that we are taking at the highest priority the privacy of individuals, but we're also taking into account that it is a good thing to try and share our research data materials. So that is the bulk of the talk, and I'll just run through a few other resources that I put together that I think could be really useful if you want to learn more about this topic. So we recently had the OHBM virtual meeting, and in that we had the open science room, which is like a virtual meeting inside a meeting. And we had a bunch of really nice talks on different topics, and including in that was a few short talks. One by, I put them in the wrong order here, but anyways, number 3 and 4. So there's one by Emma Blimke, and she was talking about privacy preserving tech. And that is actually a whole other approach, where the approach is not to try and share the data, but to try and build technology that can allow us to access data without like accessing it. So you submit, for example, your pipeline for analyzing data that is already specified in a certain way. And then that pipeline is run on the data at a location that is kept secure, and you don't personally get access to that data. And then you get your results out of that. So this could be a very crude explanation that I'm giving now, and I suggest you speak with Emma if you want to know more about that, or you have a look at their talk and their abstract. Also a talk by Doreen Heiser, which was also a demo at this Open Science Room about practical ways to share MRI data. And they developed in their group a nice workflow, like a chart that says, I want to share data, and then like asking yes, no questions and kind of guiding you to a point where you are more comfortable with the ins and outs of sharing data. So that's a really practical way of getting involved. And then we also had some nice discussions, like on a high level, number 2 here, are we converging or diverging when we talk about data privacy and data sharing? That was a nice hour discussion, and also another hour discussion on MRI data anonymization. And obviously there are a lot more resources or talks on this topic that basically just outside of the scope of my knowledge. So if you want to add to this, please let me know. Also resources on anonymization and privacy, and this actually I was busy with this 5 minutes ago, but I will add like 3 or 4 more articles here, and it's all about what research are people doing to actually try and re-identify anonymous or pseudonymous data, specifically neuroimaging data, and to see like what is possible in terms of kind of the bad algorithm. Just to let us know that there are technologically reasonable means to re-identify, and what should we do currently to mitigate the risk of that happening. Also, I will add some more links here to actual anonymization tools and their processes. Data sharing repositories, that's an interesting one. So there's OpenNeuro that a lot of you will probably know about for this type of data sets. NeuroVault for statistical maps. Zenodo and Figshare are also quite nice, and you can upload large data sets. But most of these do not enforce or do not give you the ability to enforce a data use agreement. So that's something to keep into account. And one that does, that I'm personally familiar with, is Dataverse.nl in the Netherlands, but there might be similar ones in other places. And also then at the Donors Institute, they have the Donors Data Repository, which can do the same. So my take-home messages, I think GDPR compliant brain research data sharing is definitely possible, but it is complicated and requires a lot. And I probably left out a few words there. It requires a lot of effort, and I think it requires too much effort from researchers individually, and we need to shift that to a more procedural thing. But currently we're working on this collaboration to try and get consensus like worldwide, which is obviously challenging. But I think when we work on that community effort more, we will highlight more the challenges and find practical solutions to that. I think it's important that always you have to remember that it's a balance of risks and benefits. So there's no clear-cut answers in GDPR and whether you can share it or not. There's some obvious things that that you have to have a legal basis, etc. You have to de-identify and mitigate the risk, but like where exactly those boundaries lie is not clear, and it differs between different institutions or places. But you also always have to remember, I think, to think in terms of balancing those risks and benefits when you share data. I think it's important to start planning for sharing like way before you actually do the project. I think that's challenging for a lot of current projects. Like to go back and ask for consent is yeah, difficult. But when you start applying for ethics approval, I think you also need to start with a data management plan, a data sharing plan, and all of these things that the open based consent can help with. I think it's important to like single out individuals at your institution that can help you with this already early along, and tell them at the data protection office, I want to share data. This is what I know, and can you help me? And I also would encourage people to not try and do this on their own, and perhaps try and join an effort like I was talking about, or similar ones at your institutions. And if you want to collaborate, please come and contribute to this open brain consent project. I do add some details here, so you can join the Mattermost channel, which we have. It's a public channel that you can join the conversation with, and we also have this GitHub page that you can open an issue or ask questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks, Stephan, for this interesting talk. Lots of food for thought, I would say, lots of questions. Either way, I have lots of questions myself, so I would start with something which refers to participants themselves when they're going to, let's say, when they're going to take part in an experiment or stuff like this. So I think that there is lots of information for them to digest. If you include, let's say, stuff related to the data privacy, impact, and so on and so forth. So I think you had an interesting conversation on Twitter a few days ago about this. Is there like a way to present these problems to the participant in order for them to decide in a let's say as freely as possible whether they want to share this information or not, and to avoid either getting them bored, something like yeah, share whatever you want, or let's say to make them feel sort of pressure, say yeah, I have to do this because it's good for social terms and so on and so forth.
So my background is not like in that level of communication, right? So I might have different opinions than people who really work in that. But I think that's a really core point that is missing currently is focusing a lot on making this information more interpretable to data participants. So I think, and that's what I was alluding to in the goal of this open brain consent to also provide educational material. And I'm thinking like, if you have a website dedicated to a certain type of research where the risks are in general similar, and you can find some consensus on that, then you can start working with people who are great at communication and science communication and explain that with infographics and with relevant information. Like, what does anonymization mean? What is the risk to me as a participant? What will happen to the data? What are possibilities of things that can go wrong? And what are the benefits? So I think that there needs to be like a dedicated effort on that communication level. Because yes, people try to do that in the, and probably people achieve a lot in doing that with a participant information letter that you share when you recruit them for a study. But yes, I guess it's a lot of information, and we need to work on ways to make that more interpretable and like user friendly. Yeah, the best thing I can think of is something like a dedicated website or tool that helps you through that. But I think like people with more experience needs to like participate in designing something like that. Also, participants. So I think it would be great to have like people who actually take part in the studies to have them part of the design process.
I think this is an interesting point. There are, I think, in all the departments, there are like experienced fMRI participants that could help. Yeah. I would call on screen Giulia Dore if she's available, because I think she has. Yeah. Floor is yours, please.
I was just in light of where was your concluding thought about finding a balance between risks and benefit. I agree that we need to be very visible and perhaps open-minded. And I'm one of the lawyers that actually is not so conservative towards GDPR interpretation. But what I struggle to make researchers understand sometimes is that we need to predict the most we can. So when I speak with the researchers, I always wonder whether they have this picture in mind. So if they actually have a clear idea of what are the purposes that they are going to seek, or if this is most of the time is random and they cannot predict it. So I want to know what is your opinion as a scientist, first of all, about it. So do you think that it's reasonable for us as a lawyers to expect that scientists have such clear picture, or it's not really possible?
When you say for scientists to have such a clear picture, do you mean with a clear picture with regards to the risks of sharing data, or
to the purposes, to the use of the type of processing that they need to undertake, especially in terms of secondary purposes? So
yeah.
Do they envision them?
No, I think so. I think in general. Yeah, so I cannot speak for scientists as a whole group. I can speak for me and my experience. But I would say that a lot of scientists I come across do not necessarily, they focus on their work. So they do not necessarily think about like what is the reuse value of the data in future and what type of, you probably only think about that when you get to having to decide what specific wording do I have to put in my participant information letter for how the data might be reused in future. I think the people who do think about this are like science proxy type jobs or focus areas, like what I'm currently kind of doing, which is actually not my main job, but trying to focus on making these improving these processes for how we communicate this and how we get consent, etc. I think those people will have a clearer idea, and what they will likely tell you, or what I can tell you, is that we cannot predict exactly what people will use it for. So as an example, in my recent consent form, I say, okay, the primary purpose is so it's fMRI methods, and I want to look at statistical processes and whatever with regards to the data. And for future, it will be used for scientific research purposes in the field of functional MRI methods. So that could be a nice case study, because in some cases, a stricter interpretation might say that you have to specify more, like maybe you only want to look at like prediction value or whatever, or maybe you should make it like more vague, like just scientific research. But I don't think there's a clear answer on like that we can predict exactly what people will use it for. Like someone might just want to grab a screenshot and put it on a website because a brain looks cool.
Replicate.
No, it was perfectly clear. I also have the same impression. But again, as a lawyer, we have a certain idea of how the work should go and how we expect scientists to behave, especially with regard to GDPR. But then we have to realize that reality is not always the one that it's written in the law. So we really need to interact with scientists and to discuss all of these very contentious issues.
I think that's a core point. Like what we also want to do with this community effort is, and what we have been doing is having researchers, data protection officers, lawyers, data stewards, everyone in the same discussion, and not just a science-driven thing. In the chat, I see from Carlo, I have a question.
On the same line, maybe you can tell to the subject what you are not going to do with those data. And so maybe the subject will be more reassured about the final reuse of the data, if that is going to be possible, obviously.
I think that is actually the reason why we add things like the data use agreement. So instead of focusing on what we cannot tell the subject or the participant rather, because we cannot predict if people want to use it for that method or this method or just to look at pictures, we show them in the consent form what they consent to it being used for, and we show them in future what the secondary purpose is, and we explain to them that that could be different types of research methods that people employ there. And we also show them the people who are going to have access to your data, they agree to this data use agreement, and this is what the agreement specifies in terms of risk mitigation steps. And that would include not trying to identify them, not sharing it, and other measures.
Yeah, I was more considering something like for profit or not for profit.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that to me is quite still a very gray area. I'm not sure how to talk about that actually.
And then I want to add one more question is, GDPR is for Europe, so I'm wondering what about the rest of the world?
So there are a bunch of countries that I'm not sure exactly what the list is, but there's a European Economic Area where they include more than Europe that are to some extent included in what the GDPR expects, and there are some. I think what it's called privacy equivalence or something. Some other countries that have been specified as part of a list that you can share with, that you can assume that they employ similar regulations or steps. And I will also have to find the resource for that. But I'm not too educated about the privacy laws of other countries that do not fall within the European Economic Area or that have reached equivalent status. And I think the importance there is to get people from that as part of this discussion. So we have a few people who started with the project already that's working with a Canadian open neuroscience platform. And I'm not sure where they fall according to the status, but the idea would be to get people from all these different countries into the same discussion.
Thank you.
I would have just another observation. It's not even a question, it's like a concern, which is strictly related to MRI analysis and practices. And this is something that I really struggle to find information on the web. It's incidental findings. So, okay, let's say there are incidental, in MRI, for research, most of the time it's let's say, clarified that the sequences we are going to use are not diagnostics and so on and so forth. But still, I think 5% of the scans, of the structural scans, they report something. And then I think just a physician could establish whether that's something it's relevant or not, because, for example, a researcher himself can see just like a gray area and start saying, okay, this is a very bad thing. Then neurologists come and say, yeah, it's nothing really important. And then another researcher could say a perfect brain. And then a neurologist come in and say, okay. So my point was whether you have, I don't know, a take or experience related to this. So sharing data that somewhere, sometimes in the future reveal something wrong. And at that point, it's not only like the scientific part of the story, it's also an ethical
so we
part of the story.
In my own experience, so our institution does that has been part of the informed consent and the participant later and the informed consent before GDPR existed as well. Yeah. So they specifically asked for consent to have the images looked at by an expert for anything that would exclude them from the study, but also for things that might pertain to their health. And in that case, they asked for consent to notify their general practitioner. And that kind of just goes into the things that you ask for permission for based on the legal basis of consent according to the GDPR in our case. So you ask to be able to process that data, and for that you need well, you're going to have the scan, but you need their name and general practitioner details and their contact details. So that is an explicit checkbox that they need to check. That's how we deal with that. And essentially, if you have to organize the process, essentially that happens at a certain point, and that the data set is then said it's fine, there's no incidental finding. And after that point, you can, if you want to or need to, you can delete that, that part of the personal information.
I see. I think, yeah, I think this resembles what we do also in Italy. We actually have like a specific part of the national regulations related to this. Basically, in Italy, you can have like every MRI scanner requires a physician, so this is something. I see. Yeah. I see. I think also Googling around this is, I think, something which is not completely deepened all around the websites, but I think it's a good thing that, for example, in the Netherlands, I think, you have also this kind of like taking care of this aspect. Mm. I would ask Camille. I think it's already unmuted, so if she wants to ask the question, go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So I was curious about what you would see at the next steps for open brain consent. So you've shared that there is a template right now, it has been translated in multiple languages. There are anonymization tools, but you've also invited the community to come and join the project. So what would be next? Like more translations, having that consent form data user agreement used by more institutions? Or you also mentioned educational content. So how, like, what would you start with?
So thank you for the question, Camille. I would start with getting the current template to be used, actually. So I think an important point here is it needs to get some momentum. Because if you mention open brain consent to your institution, they're not going to know about it, probably. But even if you don't mention that name, if you just mention like we have some principles according to which we want to ask for consent to share the data, it's always useful to say that this has already been used by this university, that institution, etc., these different countries, especially in this vague sense of the GDPR, where it's difficult to interpret exactly what the regulations are. So I would push for this template being used, or variations of that template being used at different locations. That would be great, such that we can, it's like a try and test and fail and improve scenario. So we use some, I've already taken the template back to my data protection office again, and then gotten more feedback already that I think could be useful to implement in a new version of the consent form. So I think that is a core part. So if anyone is interested and is going to start up a study and wants to start with this process, I would be happy to talk to them. And then also the educational content, I think someone who likes to distill like complicated stuff into like user-friendly and interpretable and understandable like bytes of information, I think that's really useful and necessary, because this is really complicated. I've tried to make it more interpretable in this presentation, but I don't think anywhere there really exists a nice resource where people can go to from a researcher perspective or participant or anyone else, like legal experts, etc., to really single out the core GDPR principles that relate to this whole process, and then to explain what that means for the different stakeholders. I think creating like a website to do that is, at least it's the first thing that jumps to my head, but maybe there are better ways. But I think if someone has experience with that and likes this project, that would be a nice starting point to contribute.
There are no other questions in the chat. Let me check. I'm scrolling. So I would like to thank Stephan for this interesting presentation on a relevant theme for all the people working with data sharing in neuroimaging. And I think we can close his session, and we'll be back in 10 minutes with camera 9 from from CERN. Thanks, Stephan.
Thanks, Vittorio. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.